Being a channel focused on retro video games, one of the things we like to celebrate is how older video games have not only remained relevant, but also quite popular. Well, perhaps no game represents this better than Outrun, released to the arcades in 1986. The classic arcade racer from Sega, and a long line of classic arcade racers from Sega. You see, Sega built up a real pedigree over the years when it came to racing games. Whether it be Turbo, Hang On, Daytona USA, Sega Rally, Crazy Taxi, or numerous other games, they made racing games for a long time and had a ton of success doing it. But of all these games, perhaps the most iconic racer they ever made was Outrun. It would make a good debate for sure, but for my money, I'd give Outrun a bit of an edge just due to the fact that it's older than most of the other popular choices. The iconic red Ferrari, scenic roads, classic music tracks, the game really nails the aesthetic it's going for and is instantly recognizable. The game has endured brilliantly as well. It had a ton of different releases back in the day and has continued to be released on newer hardware decades after its release. Not only that, it even receives fanfare from channels that focus on modern games when it does see a re-release. Like, hey everybody, Outrun has been released on the Nintendo Switch, pretty cool, right? This game has been released on so many different platforms, it's insane. You know how you'll see lists for like the top 10 or 20 games for an entire console? Well, you can find lists online people have made just of the top 10 or 20 versions of Outrun. Here's a list of a bunch of the different versions of the game, and this isn't even all of them. If you've never played the game before, it's not for lack of opportunity, that's for sure. My two favorite versions are probably the Sega Saturn release and the 3DS release. The Sega Saturn version is awesome because of its accuracy to the arcade original, the extra music tracks, in the Japan version at least, and I also find it to be really fun to play with the Saturn racing wheel. The 3DS version is awesome because, you guessed it, it's in 3D. Of course, if you don't enjoy 3D, you'll want to disable that feature. Heck, I know it makes some people feel nauseous. But for me, I find it to be one of the best implementations of 3D I've ever seen on the 3DS, and especially if you have the quote-unquote new 3DS that handles 3D much better. And yeah, unfortunately, there's no way for me to show the 3D effect on camera. Okay, so let's talk about the gameplay experience itself. Perhaps the first thing that jumps out about Outrun is the way it looks, and specifically the pseudo 3D effect used to create a sense of depth and movement. This was a technology that Sega developed called super scaling, in which the sprites on screen could be scaled to look either closer or farther away while still maintaining buttery smooth frame rates. It was first used on the game Hang On and appeared in many other games as well, but it's hard to argue against how much Outrun contributed to the popularity of this effect. The objective of the game is pretty simple. Try to make it to each checkpoint with a limited amount of time until you reach the end. Along the way, you're able to choose different branching paths, which really contributes to the replayability of the game. Now, some people might say, how is this a racing game if you're not even racing against the other cars? Well, you are still racing against the clock and yourself. I suppose it just depends on how you define a racing game. But speaking of those other cars, you may not be racing against them, but you will still hate them. They drive really slow, like to change lanes right in front of you, despite being a freaking red Ferrari driving 270 kilometers per hour, and as a result are constantly getting in your way as you try to make your way past them without crashing. You ever drive on the freeway and see some maniac driving way faster than everybody else, weaving in and out of traffic, and think to yourself, gee, that seems pretty dangerous? Well, in Outrun, you get to be that maniac, putting everybody on the road in danger, including yourself. And your passenger friend, my goodness. I always just assumed your driver is on a first date and trying way too hard to impress. I mean, considering he owns a Ferrari, I don't think it's unfair to say he may have an insecurity complex. As you would assume, the key to doing well in this game really depends on you not crashing, but you still need to make sure you're going fast enough or you'll never make it to your goal in time. Thus, the huge hook of this game is the tried and true formula of risk versus reward. The more skilled you get at the game, the more you'll be able to speed through the sections that are trickier to navigate. Now, I'm no expert at the game, however, if you're a beginner, I'd suggest to focus more on simply not crashing at first. Then, once you get more comfortable at weaving in and out of traffic, you can start to be more aggressive and go faster through these parts. The game gives you a few tools in order to manage your speed more efficiently, and you'll want to take advantage of this. You can of course just release the accelerator, you can tap or hold the brake if you need to slow down even more suddenly, and in tandem with doing all of this, you'll want to manage which gear your car is in. Being an older arcade racer, this is kept simple enough by just having a high gear and a low gear. By default, you'll want to spend the majority of your time in high gear, but knowing when to switch back and forth from low gear is key. You see, while low gear gives you a more limited top speed, it allows you to accelerate faster at lower speeds so that you can quickly get back up to higher speeds and back into high gear. I suppose you could just change the settings so that the gear shift is automatic, and perhaps you may want to do this as a beginner, but ultimately shifting gears yourself is going to give the game a lot more depth. Some of the best moments in the game come from successfully making your way through heavy traffic areas and feeling like you've utilized all the tools at your disposal. The thing with racing games is that the experience becomes way better when you know what you're doing, though I suppose that could be said about all games. Outrun doesn't always get a fair shake from people because they just jam on the accelerator without any attention paid to the nuances of driving, wipe out really bad a couple times, and then just shrug the game off. I'm not saying everybody would like this game, but a really satisfying experience is waiting for those who give it the proper chance. But speaking of those wipeouts, they can be pretty brutal, can't they? The design philosophy behind Outrun has been described as trying to capture the feeling of going out driving somewhere scenic where driving is a joy and not a burden of transportation like it is most of the time. You're cruising along to beautiful scenery, fun music, and then all of a sudden you wipe out in what appears to be a horrific crash in your expensive red Ferrari. But nope, you just respawn and keep on driving with the music never skipping a beat. It's that kind of subdued humor that exemplifies the charm of Outrun as well as older retro games in general. Making it all the way to the end of Outrun is pretty challenging, and there's some strategy involved on top of being able to drive well. I mentioned the different paths you can take earlier, and figuring out which paths you have the easiest time making your way through can really help out. Plus, if you ever want to challenge yourself, you can always try to make your way through the more difficult sections and even try to reach all the different endpoints the game has, because yes, there are different endpoints depending which path you take. It really is a great game and easily one of my favorite arcade games of the 80s as well as arcade games in general. Solid gameplay, beautiful course design, and memorable music. Yeah, I barely even mentioned the music, but even besides the game itself, the music alone can be considered iconic. Just pick a song on the radio and then it's time to go for a drive. For this video's question, I'd like to ask you all what you think of Outrun, and because I'm not expecting every one of my viewers to be a huge fan, I'd also like to ask if watching this video has perhaps changed your perspective of the game at all. That would be some really great feedback for me to have. So with that, leave your comments down below, and I will see ya in the next video.
He's the retro bird, yeah, and he's talking about video games. He's the